Once, a very long time ago, there was a horse thief in the town. Who this horse thief is named, we had long since forgotten that name. But once the horse thief was discovered, the entire town formed a mob and chased this man out of town. He was chased for many miles beyond the town limits and deep into the woods. When the man finally passed out from exhaustion, he broke down on the foot of a very large tree. The mob, seeing the man down and broken by the tree, decided the best way to punish the man was to hang him. So, the mob took a very long rope and hung the man from the highest branch in the tree. While the man hung there and began to choke to death, his neck refusing to break, the people below him celebrated. But even after the man's death, his story didn't end there. Even as the people celebrated beneath him, he realized that he still lingered on this world. That night he was not sure what to do, but as time went on and the people passed out drunk, he found he could lower himself closer and closer to the people. The first person he touched that night, he touched on the forehead, and when they woke up the next morning they had a splitting headache. Another person he touched that night, he touched on the mouth, and they woke up with sores in their mouths, constantly bleeding and unable to heal. The final person he touched on their nose. That person died that night, the sores in their mouths growing so bad that they bled into their lungs. So, after that night, the town decided that this tree was haunted. And despite deciding that it was haunted, every year someone brave would try to go there, with the dead man's body still hanging from the tree. But his ghost still lingered, and anyone who saw his ghost, with its elongated neck and sharp fingers, would just take one touch of his cold, cold hands, and they would turn ill. Whatever his ghost was, it brought plague and suffering to others. So, for a long time, the Hangman's Tree was a haunted place, and most people were smart enough to go there. Though one day, many, many years later, too many for the former horse thief to count, while his body hung from a tree, a storm passed by. And as the storm rocked the body back and forth, the body finally fell from its noose onto the ground when it was struck by a bolt of lightning striking the dead man's heart. Now on the ground, the body began to shake and tremble before it finally stood on its feet, for the first time in almost 100 years. Its body had mostly rotted away at this point, but still it had a hiss, and its teeth looked still sharp. But the strangest thing was the ghost of the man still lingered, and he didn't linger in the body. He watched as the ghoul wandered away from the tree and towards a farm that could be seen in the distance. At first the ghost, or should I say the Geist, simply decided not to go, but then found himself being dragged along. For whatever reason, he wasn't haunting the tree anymore. He was haunting his body, and he couldn't go very far from where his remains were, even if his remains were still shambling along. So the Geist followed the body. The ghoul wandered towards the farm. At first, the Geist thought it just wandered towards the farm because that was where noise was coming from. But as time went on, the Geist found out that he could order the ghoul to do things, and it would. Simple things, mind you. The ghoul wasn't necessarily a very smart creature, but it knew how to pick something up, it knew how to swing something, and most importantly, it knew where directions were. So, the Geist guided it along its path, and as the ghoul shambled along the path and reached the farm, the Geist found a tree stump that had 2 axes in it. The farmer must have had reason for those axes there, but the Geist couldn't figure it out. Still, the Geist ordered the ghoul to pick up both the blades. Despite the Geist's nature, even though it could touch people and leave illness upon them, it had difficulty actually carrying things. So, the ghoul, armed with both blades, 2 axes, one in each hand, continued its shamble towards the town, just in time for the farmer to see. Before the Geist could give the order to the ghoul reached back its right arm behind its head and swung the axe, throwing it straight at the farmer, the axe striking him through the front of his face and halfway through his skull. The Geist spent over 5 minutes trying to guide the ghoul into just taking the axe out of the farmer's face. When the ghoul finally understood the directions and removed the blade, the farmer itself, he also stood up. The farmer, when he stood, his face opened like it was a flower, with the remnants of his blood dripping down his shoulders, looking practically headless, but the remains of his head draped over his shoulders, front and back, like a flower. Impressed by this, the Geist gave orders to the new farmer ghoul and found that it also obeyed its orders. This was going to be a lot of fun, said the Geist. He still wanted revenge upon the descendants of those who hung him from that tree, so he ordered his 2 ghouls towards the town. As the ghouls carried on towards the town, the farmer's wife saw what happened to her husband and called the police of the town, begging them for help. So the police of this small town set up a blockade, with all 5 officers guarding it, all armed and waiting for the 2 ghouls and the Geist to show up. When the ghouls got close enough to fire upon, the police fired upon them many times, knocking the ghouls to the ground and even causing significant damage to their bodies. But regardless of how often they were shot in the heart or shot in the head, they still would not go down. Still, though, this made the Geist very unhappy. Surely if they kept firing upon the ghouls, eventually they'd find a weak spot, right? So, the Geist snuck up underneath the ground very carefully, and then struck at the first officer, grabbing at their ankles and causing the officer's Achilles tendon to atrophy. With the officer's Achilles tendon atrophied, the ghouls began to approach. As the officers laid on the ground, writhing in pain, unable to reach their bullets, the Geist gave a single-worded order to both of its ghouls, an order that the ghouls obeyed with vehemence. Feed. A witness to these events, with their golden eyes, ran from the scene and told the local hunter of the town what had happened. The hunter, hearing what happened, took his crossbow and then informed his wife what had happened. While doing so, he asked his cousin, Marcus, to go start digging a trench, because they were going to need it for what he called the bubonic pit. Now, the 5 officers added to the Geist's small army of ghouls, they continued their march into town. The hunter, Mixcoatl, asked all the citizens he saw to hide in their homes until he had dealt with this. Fortunately, they listened. So, when Mixcoatl and his wife Xochitl saw the ghouls in town, they were able to see what they were. Maria noticed, and then she whispered to her husband what she observed. These are 7 ghouls. Not Sandy syndrome, they're supernatural. So we need something of either a Longinus class or a Templar class to take them down. The thing is, there seems to be a Geist amongst them, and not just any Geist, but an actual plague spirit, so we can't let it touch us, lest we grow ill ourselves. Normally, plague spirits need to hang close to their remains, within about 10 feet or so, but if the remains get destroyed, then the plague ghost will be released too. So we have to be very careful and try to figure out which one of these, she waved towards all the ghouls, is its remains. Otherwise, we could be dealing with something much, much worse than a ghoul outbreak here. Mixcoatl agreed, so he decided to do a test shot. He saw the ghoul in the middle of the pile, with its hissing voice and sharp teeth, and fired an obsidian bolt from his crossbow towards its heart. Sure enough, the Geist manifested, grabbing the bolt and throwing it aside. "Don't you dare strike at my ghouls," the Geist roared, leaning forward with all of its might. Fortunately, Mixcoatl was over 10 feet away, so he couldn't be touched by the plague spirit. But still, it was mad, and still it ordered its troops towards Mixcoatl. This'll work, Mixcoatl thought to himself as he began his job of distracting them. He stepped back often. Ghouls may be powerful, but they don't move very quickly. And each step he took backwards, the ghouls knew to take 2 steps to match with him. So, firing bolt after bolt towards the ghoul crowd, leaving a prayer to Kisin, one of the gods of the dead, asking to make sure that each bolt fired was holy. The Geist would attempt to knock down the bolts, but it wouldn't always succeed. But it also wouldn't always notice when a bolt took something out from behind it. It cared about its one body, but as long as Mixcoatl gave it something to focus on, something to hate, something to hunt, then it didn't care what harm it took. And this was what Mixcoatl was counting on. With all the ghouls now dead, leaving a stream of bodies like a bizarre Pied Piper, the Geist and its ghoul approached Mixcoatl mere steps away from its range. Still, Mixcoatl ducked and dodged, stepping with all the ease of a dancer and with all the grace of a hunter. Finally seeing the pit in place, Mixcoatl stepped around one last time and then kicked the body of the ghoul into the pit. A pit that his cousin Marcus had been digging this entire time. The pit was just over 10 feet deep, so with the ghoul down on the bottom of the pit and the Geist dragged along, it was unable to reach them. Normally, to get rid of a Geist or ghost of any kind, you would need to give its remains a proper funeral or a proper burial. The thing is, it's really, really hard to give bones or bodies a burial if they're still moving around. And normally, to kill a ghoul, you would need a holy weapon of some kind, or you would destroy the body completely. But if the body was destroyed completely, or even killed with a holy weapon, then the Geist would be free. And if the Geist was free, then there would be a plague spirit in town, infecting anyone it touched with something that was incurable and completely lethal. So this pit was their best bet. While the ghoul tried to climb its way up, and the Geist yelled its curses up at Mixcoatl and Xochitl, they didn't notice, for the ghoul's sense of smell had long since faded, and the Geist couldn't smell at all, that the entire pit was filled with gasoline, up to their legs. Xochitl struck a match and tossed it down into a pit. Now, most people, when they think funerals, they think a hole in the ground, you dig it, and you put something in there, you say a prayer, and it's done. But they often forget that a pyre can work just as well for a funeral. With the body in flames and a prayer said by Mixcoatl, that the funeral was considered complete. The Geist could no longer leave the body, and as the flames burned out the ghoul, reducing its body completely to ash, that was now complete. With that all done, they quickly filled the hole, leaving nothing left behind. As they wandered down the street looking at the bodies, they began to wonder how they get paid. Marcus initially suggested, Hey guys, maybe we should ask the police chief. I mean, aren't they supposed to be the ones that pay bounties for this? Mixcoatl shook his head. Nah, I'm pretty sure I fired an obsidian bolt through his heart like half an hour ago. You mean he was a ghoul? Let's go with that. This brought a chuckle up with the group. Hey, maybe we can ask the mayor for payment. I mean, don't they pay bounties when the police chief can't? This just brought a different chuckle from Marcus. I'm afraid the mayor's an imperial, so he's not willing to part with money to improve his town's well-being. Xochitl perked up at the statement and responded, well, maybe he'll pay. If we tell him this was research on wood, then he'll have to pay us at least 2 billion centi for it. This brought a hearty laugh amongst all three of them, as they all walked out into the sunset. Thank you for listening to this story. This is always a lot of fun, bringing in Mixcoatl, Xochitl, and of course his cousin. Just all the fun with this, and definitely a creature I've had on the mind for some time. Thank you again for listening. Have a good rest of your night.